Badru. My name is John Walugembe. I'm the Executive Director of the Federation of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises Uganda. The Federation is an umbrella body for all micro, small, and medium-sized businesses countrywide. And we are a voice. We are their voice. We ensure that their issues, every time someone mentions about SMEs, those issues are brought to the fore and are part of all important policy discussions in our country. Thank you for inviting me here.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. And my name's Gilbert Junior Rejea from K Innovation and Incubation Center and from Startup Uganda. Pleasure to be here.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Asinde from the Kampala Entrepreneur Ecosystem Project, which is an action research focused on ecosystem building, developing tools around ecosystem building. I'm also the founder of a marine financial group that is focused on bookkeeping, supporting SMEs with bookkeeping.
Hello everyone, the audience and to our viewers. My name is Richard Zulu. I am the team lead at Outbox, which is an innovation and entrepreneurship support organization based here in Uganda, working with early stage entrepreneurs. I'm also the chairperson of Startup Uganda, which is our association of innovation and entrepreneurship support organizations that's hosting this Kampala Innovation Week. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, since everybody is kind of plugged a little bit about themselves, let me also tell you a bit about myself. My name is Badru Ntege. I'm the Group CEO of NFT Consult and also NFT Mawazo. Mawazo Hub is what we call our new mobility hub, and it's focused really on all issues around mobility and the entire ecosystem. And you'll see a lot more coming during the next few months. Okay, so let's get to why we're here. The conversation is about a path to a Startup Act. And I'm going to be a little bit radical today, as usual, and I'm going to say, do we really need a Startup Act? We already have a Companies Act, and we have a number of acts. So I'm going to ask the panelists here to actually be able to really tell us why and justify why and what is a Startup Act. Let me start with John to actually just tell us what you think a startup is in your view, and after John finishes, I wouldn't mind any member to actually either agree or contradict that, and let's make it a free flow.
Okay, thank you, Badru. My view is that in the Ugandan context, for a business to be labeled a startup, they should have survived for between 1 to 5 years. That's my own view. Now, do we need a Startup Act or the existing legal framework suffices? I would say the existing legal framework does not suffice. Firstly, there are many laws that are redundant and some of them are contradictory, and I'll mention a few. You've talked about the Companies Act. It has just been reviewed. And then you have the SME policy, you have the private sector development strategy, you have the NDP 3, which has also just been approved, talks about some of these things. But the Startup Act should specifically cater for young and startup entrepreneurs. And why do we need the Act? One, we need to define and label a startup. We had the same scenario in the SME space. Who is an SME? Because you would say an SME and then a big firm that makes 20 billion as turnover every year shows up. So you need to label who is a startup. Secondly, you need to, using this act, you need to say, okay, now that you have labeled this startup, what access to tax relief or financing can they get because of that definition? Secondly, how can government support them in case they have to access international markets and so on? So we think the act is important because many businesses are collapsing unnecessarily because they do not have the protection of law. So I would say we need the Startup Act as soon as yesterday, but that should not be sufficient in itself. We need to first start by reviewing what exists.
John.
And
hello? When you actually talk about the act,
yes.
So there's differences between the act and the policies.
Yes, so a policy is made by the ministry. So you have, sorry, they call a policy, that's what they call a strategy, but an act has the force of law from parliament. It's passed by parliament.
And then the policy is derived from the act.
Yeah, sometimes to power. Some don't have acts. For instance, the SME, for the SME sector, it's just a policy. It's not an act.
Okay.
So an act is stronger. It has the, once you have an act, then government is likely to channel resources to meet that need. If it's just a policy, it might be, a policy is the aspiration of government to achieve something.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Richard, I see you looking eagerly.
Yeah. So to respond to your question, what is a startup? First of all, we have to define what's a startup and come to an agreement as a country, as an industry, what a startup is. The book term is a startup. The difference between a startup and a company is a startup is searching for a business model. Okay? You have gone out into an environment, you don't know what will work or what won't work, and you're de-risking your approach. And at the end of it all, you have to find an engine that works for your business. When you find an engine where you say, if I keep doing X and Y, I'll get Z or XZ, then you have a company. But that definition is not very easy to pass on to the layman, our policy makers. When will I know that you've found your X and Y to have XZ, right? So I believe the very first thing we need to do is to come together as an industry and agree on what the definition of a startup could be, okay? And what that looks like, beyond period. And definitely that will take a lot of research and mapping of the ecosystem and trying to get an appreciation of what startups look like in this ecosystem. But
so Richard, can I just stop you there? When you say looking for a business model, would somebody then be able to say that let's leave that in academia space until you're ready, then you can pre-company? So a startup is pre-company.
Yes, ideally a startup is pre-company.
Pre-company. Pre-registration.
Exactly. No, you can even register. You can even register your startup. But you see, when you register your startup, you now become a company. But in actual sense, we know you might just be a product. You don't have a business. You might have a business, but you're still de-risking the business, right? Okay. So the academic term is a bit complicated.
But we're okay to assume that a startup, if we follow your path, because John started with 7 years.
Yes.
But by your definition is we're looking for a model.
Exactly.
Yet to start business.
Exactly.
Now, from a legislative point of view, how long are you going to be looking for a model? So
it might be 7 years, it might be 2 years, it might be 10 years. But the gist of the matter is that a Startup Act can even go beyond the period of time. Why it's important is that now the support structures I need to find that model should be supported by the Startup Act.
Kevin, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, I would like to. And I think the discussion around what a startup is shouldn't be had here, because then I would completely disagree with Zulu and say, okay, for me it is really when I look at inclusivity.
But if let me first stop you on that one. Sorry.
Yes.
Our topic is the path towards a Startup Act.
Yes.
So we must agree what a startup is before we decide what path to take.
Exactly, and this is why we cannot have that discussion here. We basically have to agree that it is imperative for us to actually discuss it, and then therefore take this discussion from here to actually say, what do we mean by being a startup? Because if we had the discussion here, it would basically, in essence, say, probably the 1 hour would probably disappear because I would come up with inclusivity, etc., etc., and yet what we are discussing is how do we actually get there? So I think I agree with both panelists that in fact what we really need to focus on is saying, okay, it is very critical for us to define it, because if we don't define it, what will happen is that we get into the murky areas we have already got into now, so that then that forms the conversation of, okay, number one, we define. Number two, what are some of the things that need to happen within the Startup Act? So that is basically where I'm coming from with that.
Gilbert?
I just wanted to ask you to ask her.
Please ask whatever you're going to ask me to ask.
Please ask her, in her thinking, with her experience, how would she define a startup?
I also want to hear.
I think how I would define a startup is anyone and everyone starting a business who has probably not reached 7 years. So I would put everyone in there, meaning that I could be like a micro enterprise. I could actually be a micro enterprise, but I'm at startup phase. Where I would basically defy a little bit in terms of years, I would actually elevate it like maybe to 1 year or 2 years, because then there you have already started figure out. So mine is much, much broader than actually defining it within the normal confines of how a startup, and basically the focus on the business model.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. I'm trying to get...
Can I
Okay.
just ask a question? So, an investor that comes from the US with $2 million.
Yeah.
Yes.
You might...
Sorry. So an investor that comes from the US
Yes.
with $5 million to
Yes.
establish a business, so long as they are less than 1 year here, they would be a startup. Would they?
Technically, yes.
Yes.
So,
Okay, I would disagree. I would say the role of the act is to support people who need hand-holding.
Yes.
So we need to differentiate between people who are okay and are just, they are here, they are all set,
Yeah.
but they are young. And then those people that are young and need support. Anyway,
okay. No,
Could I counter that? Basically, when you're talking about a startup, it includes even a person who is at exit. I could have started my business in 2 years. It probably can fetch me 10 million USD. So that means I'm exiting, and I also need the legal framework to help me exit. So that means, ideally, that anyone, regardless of whether you are really at a good place or not at a good place, the framework should allow you to do what you need to do from entry to exit for you to be able to actually start a business.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's... I see Richard tapping on the microphone.
Yes.
And then
I want to, and you brought it out very well, and I was being very academic, but the key thing here is a business that needs handholding. You need access to equipment, you need access to markets, you need access to building your talent, right? And the Startup Act is meant to ensure that all those ingredients you need are available to you, including your tax relief. So a Startup Act will even go beyond the business and take care of the environment in which that business
So
operates.
Richard, what I'm hearing before I go to Gilbert is you're more or less aligning with Kevin, because we started, what is a startup? We had a period of time. There was a 7-year, then there was the pre-definition stage. But what I'm hearing now is it's not, the definition where Kevin was saying is you cannot define which one it is, so we're just looking at a phase in a business. Should we just say it's a phase in a business?
And that phase differs depending on the sector, depending on
The type of business.
the type of business.
It has no limit.
Yes, but then we have to differentiate, because if you put time, that because I've just started and I'm 1 year, I'm a business, I have my $5 million, I know what works, what won't work, I'm not a startup. right? So that investor you've talked about should not benefit from this if they have figured out everything that they need to do.
So Richard, where you're going now is you're saying the Startup Act should be for indigenous businesses
No.
and people who don't have money.
No, it has to also attract foreign investors, but we have to really see what is this business this person is running.
Okay. Gilbert?
You started with the word radical, so I'd also wanted to become radical.
Let's stay radical.
When even I was talking about number of years, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, I was thinking differently. And I was asking myself, why are we talking about years? And I'm happy just in a few minutes ago, members were able to bring out what I was thinking. That we shouldn't look at a startup as, Kevin talked about being young. So being young in what? In market, in finances, in income, in what? And I think that's where we are putting the discussion, that if a startup is 1 year old but has, I don't know how many number of customers who are paying and the income is this much, then it's not probably a startup. So I would want us to shift the discussion from the number of years, how long the company has stayed, to exactly what the company it is, what it is capable of doing, and what it has in terms of finances and all that, before we think about giving it tax exemptions.
So what I'm hearing is based on the sector and based on the ambitions and the visions of the business, the impact will be different, or the need will be different.
Most likely.
Okay. So as Kevin said, we could be here all day trying to analyze that, but I think we've kind of aligned somewhere on that one. So let's assume that we've managed to define and gotten agreement what the startup is. What do we need to do in Uganda to actually get on that path? Though I still, you see, you need to know where the destination is, right? So let me now start with the destination. Picture yourself 2-3 years down the road, and we have this thing called a Startup Act. Can I have a quick definition from all of you what the environment should look like in not more than 1 minute? Just give me a quick statement what that environment would look like. I'll start with Kevin. 5 years from now, an act has been through the process and it's an instrument now.
I will basically focus on 3 things: quick entry, quick exit, easy for me to enter the market, easy for me to exit the market, and easy for me to get the talent. So those are the 3 things I would focus on.
Thank you. Gilbert?
With that Startup Act in place, I'm looking at us having a platform or an enabling environment, especially for these SMEs or the startups we're talking about, being able to, for instance, access cheap finance, being able to have infrastructure. They have entities or government or private sector or even partners who are able to reach out to them, just like the essence of Startup Uganda, that we bring up this ecosystem together, and the discussion, the thoughts of these different entrepreneurs from different sectors are able to influence, for instance, the policies that are related to that act. So I look at Startup Act being able to bring all these players that are disintegrated currently, that are all over the place, being able to, this instrument is bring them together and the thoughts are aligned. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
So it's recognition. Startups need to be recognized for what they're doing. They're creating jobs. Therefore, they need to get access to funding, not as a favor. Not as a favor, no. They are creating jobs. They are paying taxes. You may not know that you pay taxes, but most of our taxes are indirect. So they need to get access to that pie. They need to be handheld. They need to sit on that table and their voices are heard. And I think that's the major role that the Act would play.
So what I'm hearing, your picture 5 years from now is the concept of startup is fully understood within economy. We have funding in terms of investor funding or government funding. Okay, that's what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing from Kevin is he able to enter the market? Can you just elaborate on exit, Kevin?
Exit is basically, if I want to sell my company, it shouldn't be difficult for me to sell it to someone, because maybe the law is saying for like a foreign person to buy your company, etc needs to happen. So basically, in terms of exit, it should be easy for me to actually exit my company if I want to.
So now you're talking about an enabling environment, for example, taxing, etc.
Yeah, taxes are basically generally related to the legal framework of registration and deregistration and all that.
Okay. So
I didn't say.
Carry on. You're my boss. So
I think for me, on top of everything they've said, I think 5 years from now, a Startup Act would be one that also kind of sets a legal framework for organizations, because the way I see the Startup Act, it's building a system. It's building a runway. If you notice, when COVID-19 came, very many stakeholders did not know how to engage with startups. How do we support startups? You have money in UDB, but you have a startup, then you have a Companies Act, but you don't know how to engage. So it's setting the rules of engagement for different actors. Most importantly, the incubation hubs, the innovation hubs, the research firms, meaning in terms of standardization, in terms of certification. If you say you engage with startups, can this, in 5 years from now, the Startup Act should set that vision for you in terms of what's expected of you, what benefits do you get, and how do you utilize that advantage to ensure that you can still support startups.
So just to follow up on that one, currently for an organization to be recognized, it must be registered, URSB and all of that stuff for you to actually get any services, even to get a SIM card. So when we talk about our startup, do we still keep that, or are we wanting to change that? Just out of curiosity. Yes, John.
So,
because that's the legal framework that
so
Richard's talking about.
I happen to have registered a number of companies. So he's talking about the startup as undergoing a proof of concept, proof of business model. Now, when you register with URSB, you cannot open a bank account with any bank until you get a tax identification number. Mm-hmm. When you get a tax identification number, URA will get in touch with you at least every month. You see? Either for pay as you earn or for this. In the mind of URA, the moment you get that in, you're making money. And at the end of the year, you're expected to file returns. I don't know who of us is able to file 0 returns consistently, but it's very difficult. In fact, the Income Tax Act has now been reviewed to say if you post losses for 7 consecutive years, you'll be required to pay money anyhow. So that's why we are saying the Startup Act should exempt startups for some of these things to allow them to prove their models.
Okay, so currently, for you to be able to get any funding, any support, you need to be a legal entity. So we're trying to redefine the definition of a startup so that it can still exist in the ecosystem without all the different requirements. Is that what I'm hearing?
We are not saying that be legal.
No.
You still need to be legal, but
legal has to be redefined.
Illegal, yes. So the legal has to be defined. For instance, you will receive an assessment of. You see, you have public limited by guarantee. You have all those things, but at no point does someone like URA know at what stage are you? You get what I'm saying? At what stage
Okay.
are you? So they will send you an assessment out of the blue. And they will tell you, your first year of operation, we've assessed your income tax, you have to pay 3 million. And you're asking, where has 3 million come from? You get?
Right.
But if I have this label, possibly they will have to take a second look.
Okay. So, Kevin, do you have something to say before?
Yeah, I think he has really clarified that it's not necessarily about being illegal. It is about working within the confines of the law, but the law should be a little bit more lenient on who you are, where you are, and where you're going, because they recognize that when you arrive, probably 30 people will arrive with you. So that is, I think, where it is really coming from.
Okay. So, from what I'm hearing, there are kind of two aspects. There are bigger aspects and there are low-hanging fruit. So, would it be not easier for us to say, okay, let's do this through two ways? First, redefine the current Companies Act to allow current startups to fix current challenges, and then go down this long 5-year journey of a Startup Act, because we know in our ecosystem it's going to take that long, right? So the argument is there's certain aspects that are currently inhibiting our startups. Do we, down our path, do we first look at the existing act and modify it, have amendments to it to enable our startups to exist, and then go for a fully fledged Startup Act? Or do we move forward and go for a fully fledged Startup Act? Quick answers on that one.
We go both ways.
Okay.
Because it's only when people start to understand what a startup is, can they possibly think of amending the Companies Act. So you want to have both discussions. Now it's just a matter of what goes first, but I think you want to have that discussion at once and then determine the path depending on how our legislators have understood why this is important.
Okay. Quick one now. Kevin, do you have something?
Yeah, I would think that, yes, that is true, but I think the most problematic one is not the Companies Act, it is the income, the Income Tax Act. That is what is the most problematic. So, and that can be, is dealt with annually, so you can actually get maybe a quick win there. So maybe it's thinking, how do you start to influence that process? Yes.
But you see, you cannot earn income as an organization without a registered company, because then you have an individual company.
Yes, and we think that ultimately the company should be registered. I do not think what we are saying is the company shouldn't be registered. No, they should be registered, because then that also supports in the sense that then if they are not registered, who will you define as a startup? So it is better for us actually to do the registration. It's more
the income tax is that percentage. I think that in a nutshell, that percentage is very high.
So, okay. Members, just I have been given something for members only in the room, not those ones online, because the ones online, their vehicles are outside. There's something called UBC 378C. Members online, I apologize for that, but whoever owns that vehicle, I understand it has been seen driving itself outside the gate, so please go out immediately. So, Karen.
Yeah, the percentage.
Yes.
It's 30%. Yeah? Yes. Do you know what it means to pay 30% when you have a lot to figure out as a startup?
So we're now agreeing that we're going both ways first before we get to that point.
Yes.
And now we're now looking at, so we're now agreed that our path to a startup act is amend and drive for change. Because currently we have pre-existing issues that are prohibiting us, like high tax rates and requirements that do not fit a startup. if we're now going back to the definition of a startup, is it trying to redefine what it's doing? So, sorry, the reason I'm gonna go back down this path is when I'm registering a company, I'm very clear what I'm doing, right? In your memorandum and articles of association, you are specific or you are vague. So we stay vague until we define. John, I'm going to come to you. Let me, I know you have, yes.
So basically, because you are allowed almost 22 objectives when you're registering.
So it can be as vague as 22.
Yes, so usually the tendency is your first 5 are going to be very like the items that you actually believe you might end up working on.
Okay.
And then the others, basically you put everything. So I think that is not necessarily a major
great.
issue.
So now I'm just trying to align our discussion. John?
Yes. So my view is, I'll share the experience that, you know, the development of the SME policy took over 10 years. It started in 1997, and the policy was passed in 2015, if I'm correct, or 2017, so I'm not really sure. Actually, it's more, it's more than 10 years. So the wheels of government are very slow, and I think we also need to look at not just the Companies Act, but other acts that deal with SMEs, like the Income Tax Act, that's Minister of Finance result each year, the Companies Act, the SME policy, the Private Sector Development Strategy, and the Investment Court. Now, if you look at the new Investment Court, it spells out who an investor is and what benefits they can, you know, they are entitled to as an investor. So I would really say, let's start by assessing the situation, and then that will determine whether what the best approach to
which road we go.
Yeah.
We take.
I would add the rental income tax for incubators and accelerators on that list.
On the list. Okay. Now, we've more or less now getting an idea down this path. Where should we domicile this conversation as we go towards an act? Because we need to anchor it in some kind of a government entity. Should it go through a different organization? Should we anchor it in a ministry? What do the panelists think? I'll start with Gilbert.
Most definitely, it being an act, we must be looking at a government ministry taking it on as a lead. But as the main stakeholders, like the entrepreneurship and innovation support organizations, just like we are as Startup Uganda, should be taking lead in, for instance, laying ground, mapping the entire ecosystem.
But which government ministry?
I'm looking at Minister of Trade.
So your trade.
Yeah.
John?
Okay, I would say you need the private sector champion to push this. This would be Startup Uganda. On the other side, you need a public sector focal entity.
Yes.
It would be the Ministry of Science and Technology from my part.
So John is Science and Technology.
But if I wanted everything to move, I would say Ministry of Finance.
Okay. Yeah. Kevin?
I think I'll go with Gilbert, Ministry of Trade.
Richard?
So mine is a bit complicated. So government, in NDP3, government recently came up with a program-based approach. The program-based approach means you have a number of ministries working towards some common objectives. So the Ministry of Innovation is under the Innovation, Technology, Development and Transfer. And then you have the Ministry of ICT under Digital Transformation. But I think for me, where I would anchor it a lot is under the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, the employment industry, right? But I would rather prefer that discussion happens through the program-based approach. one of the work streams, so that a number of ministries get to own that output.
Interesting. So we have gender and labor, science and technology, trade, and then finance. Which of those have actually successfully implemented an act? Not to be quoted here. Yes. No, first answer my question.
So if you want to get things done, it would have to be the Ministry of Finance.
Do panelists believe the same thing?
Maybe I'll go with the saying that the best laws are made in Uganda, Kenya revises them, Tanzania panel beats it, and Rwanda implements. So probably the implementation, when you think about implementation, it might not be where it needs to be, but we shall have something in place that we can actually work with to be able to, like, for example, force the arm of some of the entities that probably might not listen to us. So I think that would be, I would say we still go ahead regardless of where the implementation might end up.
So the reason I'm asking these questions, so regardless of how good our intention is, we have a pre-existing structure that we want to radically or slowly change and adapt. So if we really want to succeed, we need to maybe again take up Richard's approach of both, but you really need to anchor it somewhere, yet we are going into an ecosystem structure where you can't actually anchor it into one place. So how would we, I still don't feel like we've actually really unpacked how we would move this thing from an idea into an anchor place for it to actually grow. I still don't feel we've got there.
No, I think we did, because we know we need to anchor it somewhere.
But where?
So the question is, of all these people who's willing to work with us, I know the Ministry of Science Technology is willing to go down this path, right? At least that I know. It's now about, do we start with this as the champion? Do we start with this ministry as the champion? But like everything in government, it starts with research.
Okay. So the challenge for me of going for science and technology creates an assumption that every startup will be science and technology.
But isn't that a priority focus of government in NDP3?
But I think we shouldn't do it because it's their priority area. We should do it more because we ultimately believe that startups will change Uganda. I am naive to believe that. And so we should be able to look at everyone. So if you say, I think the most important thing is actually to have the conversation, to be able to interest, like he said, have the conversation, see who is the most interested. Maybe it starts from ICT, but ends up maybe at gender but that, of course, will make it take about 20 years if we do that. So we have to be able to manage that a little bit.
So how about we narrow it down to gender, trade, and finance?
Yes.
And find the right home for that.
Why don't you add finance, innovation?
Sorry?
Why have you removed innovation? The MOSTI, science, because it's science.
You see, gender, trade, and finance. Those are the real impact. Innovation is, how often do you think about, you have these technologies there, right? But you have the people, you have the trade, the economy, and somebody has to pay for it. If you don't have him in the picture, then you struggle.
I would still want to concur with Zulu that we cannot leave behind Minister of ICT, Innovation and Technology, or Minister of ICT, National Guidance. Those two, from even our history of Startup Uganda, have really been behind our back. I mean, they easily understood what the startup ecosystem is all about, what innovation is all about. Much as you're saying that the mentality has been to do with science and technology, but at least we had somewhere to start. We had quick thinkers who are moving along with what we are putting on the table. So we would do a mix of the
early
mainstream.
adopters.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a school of thought that is going to tell you that a big chunk of our economy is agriculture based.
Which
And
is
there are so many open opportunities for startups and innovation in the agriculture ecosystem.
But if you see, what agriculture are you talking about? If we are to create jobs and build companies, technology has to underlie the scale we are looking for.
Agreed.
So either way, technology is going to play a critical role in the scale. We want scale in terms of creating jobs, in terms of building businesses, if we leave technology behind. It's the truth. We
That's
want
right.
to use hose. If irrigation will be manual, we want to grow.
Yeah.
So, okay, so anybody else in support of that? I don't want to make it a two-way, so I won't take it off. So I want to leave it for you, for the flow.
No, I think.
And
It's
having
important.
said, before we go, having said that, I know the passion Richard has with technology, so I won't go into an argument with him on that one.
So I think just
Carry on, John. Yes.
in fact I'm supporting you because you know
Thank
Richard,
you.
what you're saying is the truth. But you know you must also get into the mind of our policymakers. You may tell them the truth, but they may not understand. So I think for me, let's leave it open-ended for now. At least we have identified maybe 5 candidates. We can, you know, as you do the research, as you do the reach out, you can very easily identify where to anchor this. Richard, you mentioned something that's very, very important, the programmatic-based approach to NDP3. It means you no longer need one ministry now. Government is also focused on the result. So what we should in fact be discussing is under what program does this fall? Because today I understood that there are 3 programs that may be relevant here: private sector development, manufacturing, and digital transformation. So we need to identify which program and who is leading, and then we start from there. Shouldn't worry so much about the sector and the ministry, because government itself has moved away from that approach.
John, I like that. John, repeat those statements, because I want to go back to Richard after those 3 positions.
Okay, so there are 3 work streams of programs where the Startup Act would be anchored. There's private sector development, there is manufacturing, and there's digital transformation. So I think what we ought to do is to identify which work stream we want to prioritize. Then automatically, government has identified ministries.
John, which one would you select of the 3? Just one.
Just one?
Yeah.
I would start from. It's a tough one. I can't select only one.
Okay, let me go to Gilbert. I just want one. No reason, just give me one.
Minister of Finance.
No, the 3 sectors he's just read. Program.
Private sector development
Program.
unit.
Okay. Kevin?
I would go for private. Private.
Richard?
Man, I need to read this thing in detail, but I've been reading it for some, but it's too long.
Yes.
But let me take a hunch and go for private sector development.
You disappointed me. I thought you were going to pick the technology.
Digital transformation.
So you see, I don't know why I'm disappointing you, but you see, the ministries cut across. A ministry can be in more than one. Yeah.
Okay. Quickly again for the people in the room only. UAZ 750S. Please do something about your vehicle. All right.
Yeah,
Yes. Gilbert.
Mr. Moderator, I just wanted to, for the point of emphasis, to let the members know that, and I'm changing my position on the
You're
ministry.
free to change.
To Minister of Finance. Why? Because there is a unit called Private Sector Development Unit that is a fully fledged unit. And fortunately, it is where us, Marquet Innovation Incubation Center, lie. That's where we started from. So I would want to think that if, for instance, we gave it a little bit of energy, it should be able to do great work rather than going to the other ministries we are proposing.
Okay, great. And you're perfectly right. The other hat I wear, I'm on the board of Private Sector Foundation, and we fall under the Ministry of Finance too. So somehow, somewhere, I'm thinking our anchor, if we was to go for a ministry, John seemed to have got it, Ministry of Finance.
So finance,
before you go across.
But the duplication, I hope, will now stop. So
I think it's our job to figure out that the duplication.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is we've gotten our first step to the path. We've agreed in terms of the definition. How are we going to, though the definition is still open because Kevin is not happy yet. We've not agreed yet.
It's honestly a conversation we cannot have today. Yes, so basically
but we can start.
We can start, yes, today, but we need to finish it another time. Yeah.
So if we can start, where do we not go in that conversation based on what you think, Kevin?
This, basically, it's going to, because we are going to bring together stakeholders. All these stakeholders are startups who we think should be part of the process. And everyone will have their idea of what that is. Then after that, we can actually then start to narrow down what do we actually want to represent over the years, and therefore, what can we come up with. But if we try to have this conversation between amongst the panelists today, I do not think we shall arrive at that. So, good for us to start it, but to complete it, we need more stakeholders to actually make it a well-rounded act.
Okay, great. Richard?
What was the question? Sorry. I'm just trying to build on this, and I'm quite lost.
I want us to close the definition bit because it was still open. As much as Kevin tells us we can't touch it now, but if we can't define it now, we can't start the journey.
Yeah, I think we have indicators or parameters to start the definition, right?
Okay.
Things around at what stage are you in terms of the growth of your business. We've agreed that it's not necessarily duration, but rather, things, other indicators include the revenue you're making, all those things, right? At least we have a bit of that. So we could start there, but yes, still the wider discussion has to be had.
Okay, all right. We have another, I think, 10 minutes to close. So I want to hear from you each in terms of our current situation and where you think the biggest challenges are for startups, because that will help us pick the path. So I want to start from Gilbert, who's dealing with an incubation center, and then we'll move on.
I think partly in our discussion, we are talking about some of those challenges that our startups are facing. Maybe before I talk about them, the conversation that Kevin and Zulu was talking about, basically, to me, I would want to say that almost all stakeholders understand these challenges. They are almost clear. But the conversation, and someone sparked that conversation, probably has been that missing link. And if we went to those ministries, some of the work that I've been doing of research and the mapping of the ecosystem, they have understood what some of these challenges are. But the conversation that we are leading, for instance, as Startup Uganda, should be looked at as a solution to putting some of those challenges to the table and say, always you have known that these are some of the challenges, but what can we do together? How do we help you to ensure that some of these challenges are solved? And the basic ones, for instance, were about if a startup is able to do registration, can it also have an opportunity to bid for some of these small opportunities that are available? So if you're asking them to do the registration, they cannot register, meaning that they cannot compete with those companies have already registered, much as they have the capacity to sometimes take on some of those tasks. The other is about infrastructure, and it has been my concern always that our startups struggle. For instance, those who are in technology, they struggle to buy these gadgets expensively because of the taxes that are imposed. And then we come back to the infrastructure of internet and data, and all this is very expensive. Much as some of us hubs try to ensure that they have cheap internet or free internet, but if someone is to, for instance, do the development, those who are into startup development, then...
Okay, thank you. Let me go to our veteran in incubation, Mr. Outbox.
Yeah.
You've been through a few, I'm sure you've been through a few startups that have come through. Can you highlight those top 5 or top 3 challenges that your beneficiaries, your members have actually gone through, and if those challenges were not there, things would have been different?
Yeah. So a number of the things that we see businesses struggling with, common knowledge, the top 3 being access to markets, access to financing, and most probably access to talent. But what I want to leave us with is the whole reason we have a forum like this is the ecosystem, right? And whatever legislature we agree to should support systems development, right? In terms of if I'm running a business, do the organizations that want to support my work, are they supported by some structures or systems that cannot be second guessed? Okay? It should also encompass the incubators, those who bring money into the businesses, those who want to do corporate social responsibility into the startups. It should encompass all that. Now, I am not a lawyer. I don't know whether what that takes is an act with guidelines or regulations, whether it takes a policy rather than an act, and it would be nice to see what your view is, John, whether a policy that establishes a legislature and all that is better compared to an act, right? But at least we are in agreement that we need to have the law on our side with systems to support the development of those systems, okay? So that our young businesses can actually grow.
Great. Kevin, allow me to first go to John, because what I'm going to ask him, I know you will add to you. We have talked a lot about startups, but I want us now to just spend some time to think about that Jua Kali, that Katwe street down there where there's a lot of innovation coming out there, and small business. John, talk to me about that in the startup environment, and as I get to that, I also want you to touch about gender in this ecosystem conversation.
So thank you very much, and I think that's why it's imperative that we push this together, both people within the startup ecosystem.
Microphone.
Sorry. It's important that we push this this agenda together, both people within the startup ecosystem and those of us who have been working more with traditional small and medium-sized enterprises, the Juakali and so on. The needs are slightly different. Sometimes the people in the startup space have a certain level of education, whereas in the Juakali space, you struggle with things with bookkeeping. Tell him you must register, and he says no. Here, people may appreciate the importance of registration, but may find it cumbersome. So there's that variance, but otherwise the interests are the same. Lack of access to procurement opportunities. This is big. Over 60% of government's budget goes towards procurement. 45 trillion. Do you know how much money that is? 45 trillion this year, 45.5 trillion. Over 60% goes towards procurement. Government has passed the national local content. Is it an act?
Bill
or bill? I don't know. But it's an act, actually. It's an act. And there are opportunities to give locals particular businesses and so on. So we believe such an act would help in that regard. The other issue is the cost of compliance. The cost of complying with government regulations is too much. You know, there's a time I had not been compliant. Then I said, let me go to URA and tell them I want to recover my team. And they made me wait for 3 hours. And they told me I have to bring proof that I'm the one. Then I said, okay, can I impersonate myself to pay tax? So how do we make it simpler for people to comply? Then the issue of infrastructure, workspaces, the hubs have come in. Now, if the hubs have come in, they're helping government to incubate businesses. Can you get tax relief as hubs? And then the issue of finance. Now, every time people talk about finance, they rise up very fast. Oh, UDB has money. It's not as clear-cut as that. You know, I had a conversation with the MD on UDB and said, look, government has put aside 1 trillion, but it's mainly to push import substitution. So we are prioritizing manufacturing and so on, not for SMEs or startups, but people in that sector. But to get money from UDB, you can't ask for less than 100 million. So before you say, oh, there's money, you must appreciate some of those things. And then lastly, the issue of allowing an alternative financing mechanism to thrive. Angel investors, private equity. You know, there was a law in Ministry of Finance some time back to liberalize the pension sector. Private equity cannot thrive if the pension sector is not liberalized. Instead, government brought a law that increased the monopoly of your friends, NSSF. They are nice people, but the pension sector ought to be liberalized. Thank you so much.
They're all our friends. They're giving us money, so we'll Kevin.
I think he has already talked about what I was going to highlight, which is basically compliance. So it is a little bit on awareness and also on the cost. So sometimes there is awareness, but the cost of basically complying is high because to tell you the truth, most people are actually should be filing nil returns for the first 3 years. They honestly should be filing nil returns. But you'll find that most people have accumulated penalties because they were not aware that you needed to file once you get the tax identification number. So like for example, people do not know that annually you're supposed to actually also file with URSB. So this person is comfortable, lucky enough, probably, I don't know if I want to say it, they have not become as strict as URA. So you can actually go and easily comply. So also that affects, so people are just not aware. And then where you are aware, like for example, a social enterprise, what is going to happen is the current format of compliance does not actually cater to you, because you're making a little bit of revenue and then you have grants. Either they will tell you become a not-for-profit or as a business. So you do not know where you actually lie in terms of compliance. So they will tell you have not complied, but in fact, the rules do not actually allow you to comply. So I think that is, for me, one of the core challenges that that startups face. The second one is talent. I think that generally speaking, the talent coming out does not appreciate what it takes to work with SMEs. Then you're basically, SMEs are basically grooming for corporations. So you spend a little bit of money grooming, and then the person moves on. So I think like really trying to streamline and have a conversation of how maybe do they get motivated, but also in the startup world, it takes someone who is more agile to actually thrive in that kind of ecosystem, rather than someone who is like very particular on one thing. So those are some of the discussions that need to be had.
Okay, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversations we've had here. And I think there's a lot of work we need to do for startups at the early stage. I'm kind of, what I'm hearing, and again, members, I'll give you a quick response to that, is we're not yet ready for an act, but we're ready to amend the existing environment to create a groundswell to drive us to an act, as opposed to trying to jump on the other side when we cannot get enough people into the door. Because what I'm hearing is the cost of entry for somebody at ideation stage, at startup stage, is too high that they will not stay long enough in the ecosystem to create a need for the act. So don't we need to actually, and I was going to ask Ali, is it a chicken and egg situation? Let's first get the egg right, or I don't know which of the two we need to get right, but I feel there's something there that the aspirations are brilliant, but how do we take that first step? And Richard earlier said that you go both directions, but I tend to hear and feel we need to focus on a direction, then fork down the road. Which is that first direction before we fork?
Let me add to this. Again, I'm going back to my closing arguments.
And we have about a minute, so we'll go quickly.
We have to note that if we are saying amending or anything we do should create an enabling environment. This enabling environment, we have to be clear, is not just about me getting access to finance. It's also about the support structure, but it's also about the access to the markets. Now, the access to the markets, if I'm in health, I will need the Ministry of Health to be in a position to support a startup. If it's agriculture, I will need the Ministry of Agriculture to be able to support. And this is where I gave the closing arguments that is the right approach a policy, an act? What is that will unlock as much value as possible at scale from the get-go?
So if I kind of rephrase that topic and says creating an enabling environment towards a startup act for Uganda.
Yes.
Would that be a right way to actually just rewrite the topic and say, as we conclude,
yes,
we say that we need to create an enabling environment towards a startup act for Uganda. Do we all agree on that? It's a wonderful way to end the panel. We all agree on something finally. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been absolutely interesting, and I've learned a lot. And I'd like to see how we continue this conversation. Thank you, and goodbye. Thanks a lot, those of you who kept online. Thank you. Bye.